What's up, everybody? Today we're going to be taking a look at an early clear for me. This is Blue Revolver Double Action Hyper Mode. This replay is going to be older than anything I've showed on the channel so far, and it's older than anything I likely will show on the channel, because even this run, it wasn't that long ago, but I've improved quite a lot as a player, and looking at some of these older replays is kind of cringe-inducing for me. Not because I'm not suggesting this gameplay is like super bad or anything, but you know, as you improve and you look back at older stuff, you see all the mistakes and you see all the ways that you could do better now. But I did want to show this one because what I'd like to talk about with this game is how it got me interested in scoring systems and actually engaging with scoring systems, whereas prior to this I'd pretty much just been a pure survival player. Since we're going to be talking about score, I'm going to just briefly explain the basic system in this game if you're not aware of it. So Blue Revolver kind of has a time-based chaining system, although the chains are pretty short. When you destroy enemies, it builds up a hit counter, but it only goes up to 8. And you can see when that hit counter is active on the screen, there's like a timer that goes down. And if you don't shoot anything for a while, it'll eventually expire. But if you use your special weapon while the hit chain is active, you go into flourish mode, which activates a multiplier based on how big your hit chain is. At 8 hits, it's a 64 times multiplier, and you wanna try to have that when you're activating flourish mode. But when you're in flourish mode, you're going to use your special weapon to kill enemies. They'll drop gems, and then as long as you're in flourish, the multiplier, which in the case of an 8-hit chain is 64 times, will multiply the value of the gems that you pick up, and this is one of the main ways that you score. So the idea is that you're destroying enemies to build up small chains, which you then cash out with your special weapon. The other main scoring system is the break system, and breaks are just special actions that you can take, usually against a boss or a mid-boss. It might be dismantling a boss in a particular way, or deliberately not shooting or destroying parts of that boss. But there's special actions that you can take that have a set sort of static score value, and there's several of them in each stage. There are other aspects of the scoring system, but those are the two big ones. And one of the things that I'd like to talk about is how I think the design of the scoring in this game really encourages new players to engage with it, even if they've found other game scoring systems to be a bit too intimidating. One of the design goals of Blue Revolver, from what I understand, is that Danbo, the developer, wanted it to be a challenging game, but a forgiving one. And it's not like just a beginner game, but it can be, I think, somebody's first shmup. And I think Blue Revolver does an excellent job of having a scoring system that sort of nudges you in the direction of engaging with it. And I think there's several ways that it does that. First and foremost for me, when I first got into shmups, I was mostly just interested in survival play, but part of that was just it kind of seemed like a lot of the games, the scoring systems felt very unforgiving, at least when I first started out. Like the DDP games, for example. There's definitely something that is very interesting about the chaining system in those games, but it is kind of notoriously difficult and unforgiving for new players especially. And one of the things that intimidates people about it is just, the chains in those games affects your score in a very exponential way. So the difference between, full chaining a stage and, even just dropping your chain once and having 2 smaller chains, is the difference in score in the DDP games is like really substantial. And a lot of multiplier-based scoring games have that sort of property where small mistakes can lead to pretty enormous differences in score. And that can feel intimidating for someone who's a scoring beginner. I think Danbo correctly identified the main source of the consternation, I guess, about that among new players, and designed something that addresses that directly. So the chains in this game are very, very short. And it's true that to get a really high score, you're going to want to chain as much as you can. And you're going to want to do all of the chains correctly. And there's still quite a bit of challenge in doing that. But if you mess up one of your chains, it doesn't just totally devastate your score. And I liken this kind of analogously to a college class where basically all of your grade is just on the final exam, or maybe a final and a couple of midterms, versus a college class that's split up into multiple low-stakes quizzes and tests. When your grade is just totally based on like 1 or 2 exams, there's a lot of pressure to do well on those exams, and if you don't do well on one of them, you might not be able to recover. Whereas if the class is split up into smaller, sort of lower stakes assessments, you do still end up learning the same information over the course of the class, but it feels less torturous because, if you screw up on one of the assessments, you can recover. It doesn't just totally screw you for the rest of the class. And I think it's similar here, where splitting things up into small chains reduces the stakes of each chain and just makes it feel more approachable. With that said, I think in video games, where for most of us our livelihoods don't depend on doing well at the game, I think there actually is value in having a scoring system that demands like a high degree of perfection, and having a scoring system where even a small mistake can have a big impact on your score can have value in the sense that it allows the top players really to differentiate themselves on like a different level from the rest of us. And I actually don't think that that's a bad thing. But for someone like me, who at the time of playing this was kind of just getting into the genre and just starting to explore scoring systems, certainly the more bite-sized nature of the chains in this game was one of the biggest things that made me not feel too scared to start implementing some scoring. It is pretty much just psychological, because any scoring system you can learn incrementally, and you don't have to go for the most optimal strategies at the beginning. In fact, I think it is actively a bad idea to try to do the most optimal strategies from the beginning, at least for most people. So I think the effect is mostly psychological, but certainly I think the design of the scoring in this game has the effect of making it feel more digestible and approachable to learn in incremental steps. So that was one of the things that really appealed to me about this when I was starting out. By the way, this is the part that I feel like might be inspired by Jupiter from Betsugun. I'm not 100% sure about that, but these like circular patterns and the way they move is like very similar. One thing I do know, though, is like when this boss gets defeated and kind of the stage boss comes out, I think this comes directly from the developer himself. That's a reference to Battle Garega. But anyway, I think the chaining system in this game is really smart from the perspective of being challenging but forgiving and encouraging new players to engage with it. One of the other main things is this game has an every extend system, which is kind of like how a lot of Japanese games call a system where you just get extra lives every certain amount of points. And as far as I know, there's no cap on the number of lives you can accumulate in Blue Revolver. You just get as many lives as you can score. In Hyper Mode, I think it's every 15 million points you get an extend. And there's quite a lot of score possible in this game, so you can accumulate a lot of extra lives. For me, that system was the initial spark to try to get me to engage with score, because the difficulty in Blue Revolver, I think, is tuned fairly well, where someone of a beginner or intermediate skill level may actually struggle to clear the game without doing some scoring to get extra lives. I was certainly finding that my mistakes, especially in the late stages, were outnumbering the amount of lives I was getting, so starting to engage with score was, for me, really critical to eventually clearing the game. And it's been known for a long time that every extend systems in games is a good way to get survival players even to engage with score. But I think there are some design challenges that developers need to think about when they implement systems like that, and this is another way where I think Blue Revolver does a lot of really smart stuff. So every extend systems are great for getting newer players to engage with score, but as players get better at scoring, you could potentially end up with a scenario where, you know, players are carrying like an absurd amount of lives into the last couple stages, and then they just can get away with really not playing the game because they just have so many lives to throw away. And Blue Revolver, I think, avoids that in a couple of ways. One of which has to do just with the dynamic difficulty system in this game, the rank. So this game has dynamic rank where it gets harder up to a point as you do better at the game, and then dying reduces the rank. So it'll feel familiar for someone who is coming from like Yagawa games, but it's not nearly as punishing as that. The rank in this game is noticeable, but it's capped at a lower point than it is in something like Battle Garega. Like, there technically is a cap on the rank in Battle Garega, but it's like hugely higher than the base difficulty. The max rank in this game, level 5, is quite challenging, but it's not like absurd. So, you know, I think like most players are not going to find it anywhere near as punishing as Battle Garega, so if you're worried about that, I wouldn't worry about it. But the dynamic difficulty does a couple things. First, it just, as you get better at the game, it's just going to make the game more challenging to kind of pressure you and make it less likely that, you know, most players are going to even be able to carry huge numbers of lives into the final stages. But also it gives you some reason to use your lives as a resource. You know, if a particular section you're finding it to be too challenging, you can deliberately sacrifice lives in order to get the difficulty down. And so that's another way in which you can sort of incentivize players not to just go into the last stages with a huge number of lives. Even if they're getting a lot of extends from scoring, players are sort of incentivized to use their lives as a resource earlier in the game as well. But I actually think that dynamic difficulty isn't even necessarily the main thing that's contributing to players wanting to use their lives as resources, because the scoring system really relies a lot on your special weapon, and ammo is limited. Ammo for your special weapon comes from grounded enemies. That's one of the sources, but not every stage has grounded enemies. And so the other ways to get special weapon back are to die, or to use bombs. And you have a limited number of bombs, and one of the ways that you get bombs back is by dying. And that's actually kind of necessary for scoring. So it kind of counterbalances the every extend system a little bit. You're going to be getting a lot of extra lives if you score, but in order to score, you're also going to be sacrificing a fair number of those extra lives. And I think that's a pretty solid way of avoiding maybe some of the potential downsides of an every extend system. So that's another respect in which I think the design of Blue Revolver is very well thought out. On the topic of rank, you're not really going to be doing a ton of rank management in this game. It is useful to die occasionally to keep the difficulty down, but particularly as a newer player, you're going to just be dying anyway by making mistakes. And then even if you are quite good at the game, like I said, you are going to be sacrificing lives to get resources back. And those deaths, in my experience, are enough to keep the difficulty manageable. This is not, even though it's like influenced by Yagawa games, this is not a Yagawa game. And so if you find the idea of dynamic rank, and particularly games where rank plays a significant part in the gameplay, if you find that interesting, but then you'll also find like the rank management in Garega or Batrider or something like that to be kind of too tedious or weird, I think you'll like this game, because Blue Revolver has a much more moderate version of that idea, and I think it's a good introduction to that concept without being too out there design-wise. And then the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of this game encouraging newer players like me to engage with score is just the in-game sort of achievements. When you go to character select, each character has like some goals that the game assigns for you, and it's not obnoxious. The messages are just like they're like under the character stats or something like that. I can't quite remember, but it's, you know, you see them clearly, but they're not, the goals are not obnoxious. They are sort of staring at you every time you select a character, though, until you complete them. And that was actually another one of the main reasons I decided to engage with the scoring in this game, because, you know, even after you clear it with a character, it's like, okay, now get 90 million points. And then if you get 90 million points, it's like, well, now clear and get 90 million points. And that's actually what the goal of this particular run was to clear the game and get 90 million points. I'm not normally like super into achievements, but I think they have some utility if done well, because again, I think they're a way you can encourage players to play in a way that they wouldn't necessarily do on their own, and show them parts of the game that they might enjoy, but they might not otherwise have even attempted. And I think that was really true with this game and scoring. Like, when I first started out, I was content to just play for survival, and I initially wasn't necessarily even interested in engaging with scoring systems, but like I said, I think Blue Revolver did an excellent job of nudging me in a direction towards score play. And even though I'm certainly not, even at this point, a particularly great score player, it has changed how I look at these games, and I think that's really cool. On the subject of Blue Revolver sort of changing how I look at shmups, I mentioned earlier that I think a lot of the hesitance to engage with scoring in games is just psychological. Like, you know, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter that much that in the DDP games, like, mistakes are very costly to your score, because you can still learn those games incrementally. Like, you don't have to get a great score when you play. You can, you know, gradually improve your score over time. But that's a mentality that I was only able to sort of unlock after I'd already played this game and had fun engaging with the scoring system. So I think it's like, yes, it's easy to say like that the thing holding some people back with scoring is just mental. I think that's true. But I think it's important to have a game like this that actively makes the systems less intimidating to so that people can kind of dip their toes into it without fear. And then once they do that, I think a decent, proportion of those people will realize, oh, now I can do this in other games. And that's pretty much what happened with me. Like, I still don't play every game for score. And because scoring does take a lot of effort and it substantially increases the difficulty of a lot of these games and leads to a lot more sort of restarting and that sort of thing, I still like to know that I like a game first before I try to score it. So I usually will play for a bit for survival. So we've got one of my favorite parts of the game coming up, and I am going to shut up for a bit to just let it happen.
Danger!
I love that whole section so much. I believe that's new for Blue Revolver Double Action, which was, I think this game originally came out in 2016, and then there was a major update in 2024. And I think that reverse scrolling section was new for that update. It's really, really cool. But anyway, to continue on what I was saying earlier, like, I still do start playing games for survival typically, and there are some games that I don't feel like I'm ready quite to play for score yet, but it's now something that I'm considering with every game. And then there are a fair number of games where like, it doesn't take me very long to start wanting to engage with scoring, and then the scoring is like a significant part of my enjoyment of the game. And frankly, when I started out Shmups, I didn't really think that was ever going to be the case. I'm not really sure why I thought that, but I think a lot of new players, they're just like, oh, I'm not good enough to play for score. I'm content to just play for survival, and that's fine. Well, part of that is fine. The part of it that's fine is that there's plenty of enjoyment to be had in these games for survival, and I think players like Pan have demonstrated that there's actually a lot of depth, that, like, you can have, like, high-level survival play. Like, that's something that's possible in these games, and there's a lot of cool stuff there. So I think it's actually totally fine if people genuinely just want to play for survival. But what I found is that there were things about these games that I actually would and do enjoy that I was sort of too intimidated to even try at the beginning. And so perhaps this game could be a stepping stone for you as well, to evaluate whether score play might be something you're interested in as well. The long and short of it is, I think Blue Revolver just succeeds exceptionally well in its goal to be a challenging game that is approachable, and it achieves this really nice balance where it legitimately teaches you a lot about the genre without sacrificing, depth And I can't really speak to that a lot, but just based on what I've heard people like Jamers talk about with this game and like other high-level players of this game like Burb, the game does seem to have a lot of sauce that is satisfying even for someone who is very experienced at shmups. So basically what I'm saying, I think this is like one of the coolest indie shmups and maybe one of the coolest indie games that I've played. And whether you're a more beginner or intermediate player or whether you're an expert, I think there's plenty to like about this game, and it could be a game that, like for me, sort of changes how you think about the genre and encourages you to explore more of what shmups have to offer than you might have otherwise done. All right, well, that's what I've got for this game. I will see you in the next one.